Welcome to the Moffitt Method Podcast, where longtime strength and conditioning coach Tommy Moffitt explores everything from the art of coaching, improving performance, sports nutrition, and mental training. Now, welcome your host, Coach Tommy Moffitt.
Welcome to the Moffitt Method Podcast. If you're listening for the first time, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends. Before we get to today's guest, I'd like to take a moment to talk about the Moffitt Method Strength and Conditioning Program. The Moffitt Method Program is a culmination of my 34-year coaching career in high school and college. We offer a remote coaching solution for your organization, sport teams, and school. Our product includes a 52-week year-round lifting and running program with over 180 instructional videos. If you are interested or know of someone that may be interested, please contact us through our website, themoffittmethod.fit, or you can email us at info@themoffittmethod.fit for more information. Our incredible guest today is Coach Jeremy Jacobs at Duke University. This is Coach Jacobs' second podcast with us. The first one was released a few months ago. As soon as that episode was completed, we had already started talking about recording another one. There was so much that we didn't get to talk about. We decided to jump back in and do it again. I hope that you enjoy. What's up, Coach?
Coach, thanks for having me back. Appreciate it.
Good deal. Good deal, man. I'm excited. We got to talk about family and all before we started, but with this episode here, I didn't want to have a lot of, stuff at the beginning. I just wanted to jump right back in. Okay.
Absolutely.
So here we go. So you've been at Duke 2 off seasons now. How did it go for you guys this year? And how did the off season differ from the one that you did last year?
Yeah, so there were a lot of similarities and then obviously quite a few differences. So the first year, coming in, taking over a new program with a new head coach, a new team, we started much slower in the weight room. So we had, I think, the start of last year, 8 to 10 new incoming freshmen. And they started on the same program as everybody else because we started everybody on at the bare bones. We emptied the bar. Whereas technique, it was everything from scratch. Where this year we had about the same amount of early enrollees, but they were on a completely separate program. And then we were able to kind of advance with the returning players. We had, data on them for an entire year. We knew where their numbers were. There was, from our bowl game to us training again, it was only about 3 weeks. And so, there wasn't a whole lot of detraining going on. We trained really hard through our bowl prep. And so we were trying to, some of it was performance wise. Let's make sure these guys are set up to play well in the game. But then also how do we train enough to make sure that there's not a huge gap for when we get back? And are we hitting a heavy enough load? And credit to our guys, we had a ton of guys set PRs in our bowl prep in the weight room. I don't know if I shared this last time, but in our in-season program last year, from camp until the end of bowl prep, we had 136 PRs in the weight room between the clean squat or bench. So our guys trained heavy through the season. And I think, we'll get into this in the podcast. I think the velocity and tracking that allowed us to do it safely, and allowed us to take advantage of players' good days when they felt good in the weight room. And then as our players saw that, they came in. There's so many times where guys like, Coach, can I max out today? We'd be like, no. Like, you have to tell them no, which is funny, but also how many times do you have guys walk in the weight room and they see a certain percentage you prescribed and they're like, Coach, don't put that load on my back today. Like, it was just a philosophy shift of guys coming in and wanting to get after it rather than us trying to convince them.
Yeah. And a lot of that has to do with the carryover from the head coach and how you practice. It's the sum of everything that y'all do that allows that to happen. Now, this spring, while y'all were training, did y'all do
Mhm.
some of the similar stuff from the in-season program last year during
Yeah,
spring ball? How did that go?
so same mentality. We had a year of spring ball under Coach Elko where we knew we could go back and look at. And I talked with him a few times before spring started to where he was like, "Look, I'm not changing anything in the spring. Like this is what we're going to do. Here's my out." So our practice load didn't undulate very much. Practice looked like practice for the majority of
Mhm.
those.
Yeah.
And you get away with that because you have a day off in between practices. So,
Yeah.
but we were like, look, we took kind of, I think, last spring a more cautious approach, saying, hey, we didn't know what his expectations were. Where this spring, we're like, nope, he knows what we're doing, and we're going to be aggressive. So we had a heavy day in the weight room. We had kind of like a middle of the road day, but it was also a heavy bench press day. So one heavy day would be like heavy cleans and heavy squats. That would be the furthest away from our scrimmage days or game day on a Saturday for spring ball. And then we had a heavier, but also kind of a dynamic day with Olympic lifts and a heavier bench in the middle of the week. But then we had a true velocity day on our Friday prior to our Saturday scrimmage or game. So I made sure that we tracked those days with Perch, and I wanted to see kind of how we handled these common loads throughout the course of a 4 to 5 week training block through spring ball. And it was really neat to see like our velocity day didn't change from the first time we did it to the last time we did it, to watch those guys get better at moving the loads. Just our velocity day, we can get into this, but we were showing, a 9% improvement in just the mean velocity from when we started to when we finished.
And that was in squat, correct?
That was in squat. Yep. That was in squat. So, and we can talk about how we did that, but it was cool to show the progression. Hey, look, not only did your mean velocity, but I also, for the first time, looked at peak velocity, just because peak velocity is a component of peak power. So I wanted to see if our peak power is going up, and our load is staying the same, then obviously our peak velocity needs to be moving faster. So how much have we improved that over the course of the 4 weeks on top of? So I looked at all three of those main metrics at the same loads across time. And then you can go back and show the coaching staff, hey, look, I took it to a staff meeting and said, here's what our training loads were at certain percentages of squatting. And then you can break that down to the individual.
Right.
We created a very competitive environment in the weight room. So it was pretty cool to see how those guys responded to it. And it's changed my philosophy on some of those like themed events you might do in the weight room, where they might seem a little hokey or something like that if you see it. If you come from like a tradition, you come from an Olympic weightlifting background or that environment where it's a sterile, no music, barbells clanking in the middle of a training hall, to a place where you're putting a theme essentially to that day. But getting these guys to come in and attack the workout has shifted my thinking and how important that is.
Yeah. It's, we live in a results driven world, and you work in a results driven profession. So any way that you can get results, sometimes it's not a bad idea to get a little hokey.
Yeah, no doubt. And
that's awesome.
And we train early here too, so you got to factor that in. These kids come in, and our first lift group might be 6 a.m.
Yeah.
And so you might have to create some external stimuli to get them to have the same juice that they might have, if they train in the afternoon.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. Well, we're going to get into it. So we touched on this a little bit before we started, but spring is done, and I'm sure that the Blue Devils are getting ready or in the middle of finals, which has got to be a tough time there. How does Coach Elko and Coach Feely handle this time, the month of May, and when's the team going to come back?
Yeah. So we have, this is the first time I've seen this. So right after this, the way we started spring ball a little later, which what I liked about it is it was after spring break. So we didn't have this 9-day pause in the middle of training and practice. So we didn't have to worry about getting guys back in some semblance of shape when they come back off of spring break, because we know what they're doing on a spring break. I know what I was doing at that age on a spring break. So they're no different. And
I know what I'm still doing on spring break.
No doubt. So not having to take that into consideration is helpful, but what's cool is it pushes our spring season later to where when we finish our spring game, we're done. Like the guys don't train. They're out of the building. They do exit interviews with Coach Elko. He meets with every single player. Coach Feely meets with every single player in those meetings. And there's, we put together an evaluation sheet. And so every player walks out of the spring knowing where they're at in the program. And here are the things that we think you need to improve if you want to change where you're at in the program. And so I like that there is no secret of depth chart of what we think, or, they walk out of the building in the spring having a clear plan of, if I want to change anything about this, I have a plan going forward in the summer. And then we close the weight room. We legitimately turn the lights off, close the weight room, and say, you need to get away from this building. We need to get away from this building, because when we come back, it's for real. Now we're getting ready for the real season. So we get about 2.5 weeks to spend some time with our families and get out, and they get away and they go see their families once they finish school. And then volunteer. So there's a discretionary period here where they can come back, because they start class May 15th. So it's earlier. So, so when they come back, there is discretionary workouts, and they are voluntary in the sense of, like, there is no, if you don't show up, there's nothing we can do about it. But last year, the whole team came back and was here for that, so,
culture,
we like to, and we like to say, this is optional, but winning in the ACC is also optional. So, there's just certain things, and the guys buy into that. And they also, if they're on campus for classes anyways, there's no way they're going to see their teammates train and they're not going to come train. Yeah. So, we, as a strength staff, we're rolling, mid-May, because we're going to have the majority of these guys in here, which gives us a 10-week training summer.
That's awesome.
So you can get a lot done and get them ready to go.
Now, why does school, are y'all on quarters or semesters?
No, semesters just ends. It ends earlier. They start a little earlier in January, and then they end, their finals is the first week of May, but then they have 2 different summer sessions that they can take.
Is there a break between the summer sessions?
Yeah, there's a week break. And then also we give them the entire week of 4th of July off.
Right. Yeah.
So we'll roll hard for 7 weeks, take a week off. Then we have 3 weeks, 3 weeks when they come back. So you can really, which changes, if we're, traditionally when you're going to max somebody out, it changes. Mm-hmm. You don't have to do it at the end of the summer. You can get there, and then you can almost treat, like, you can take those last 3 weeks and peek into your camp if you want to. So it's,
when I first started training, and maybe Tennessee was on a different schedule, but when I first started working at the University of Tennessee, if I remember correctly, we had 11 or 12 weeks, in the summer. And it just seems like over my career, that time got shorter and shorter and shorter. The last 5 years at LSU, we had 7 weeks. And I think that's the way it is for most people. So to have 10 weeks is amazing.
Yeah, we can get some real stuff done.
Yeah, shoot, yeah, man. And I like training for 7 weeks, having a week off, and then spend that last 3 weeks, really dialed in on football versus having to cram everything in, the way you have to do it. So that's enough of that. Okay, so let's talk some training here. And our last episode leaned heavily toward velocity-based training. Okay. And the reason is because you're good at it. And it's great to bounce things off of you about it. And so I want to set a baseline here because we didn't do this last time, but I want to compare traditional training means where you're using percentages of 1RMs or not using percentages, but there's this, form of linear periodization that we follow. And then compare that to what velocity-based training is and what are some of the advantages of velocity-based training over more traditional means of strength training.
Okay.
So can you touch on that for us?
Yeah. So I think I'm going to start this. So I was looking through my phone for a picture weeks ago, and I realized it's impressive how many different quotes I have screenshot and saved in my pictures. But one, and I wish I had who it was from or what. It was a picture of a whiteboard, but it said everybody cleans, squats, and benches, but it's the standard with which you do those movements that count, right? And I think that's a thing that you see plenty of people especially in the strength coach social media space kind of get preachy about what they believe. But then you might see a video of their program and it kind of invalidates maybe what they're preaching. And I think the simplest way to talk about velocity-based training is it's a way of simply measuring the intent of your training. That's what it is. And so there is no guesswork. Tracking data has certainly taken off. It started in the whole GPS world and soccer and running and all that other stuff. And that's still very much important in what we do today. And this is just, I think, taking that same idea and then bringing it to the weight room. So you're taking the guesswork out of how your guys are handling your program. And so I think the biggest thing is in traditional training, you are married to the numbers that you prescribe. And then a lot of the times, the only way that you can actually progress or announce that you've made any changes positively is you have to have another testing day in a traditional 1RM or 3RM or whatever. And if those numbers don't go up, then it says that your program didn't work. And that might not be the case.
Yeah.
So based off of your central nervous system, there's an 18% swing on a daily basis of your 1 rep max, right? That's a 36% gap from one end to the other. So if I train and I test and I squat 400 pounds today, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to squat 400 pounds tomorrow. If I tested tomorrow, maybe I squatted 410 or maybe it was 390, whatever. And so how do I quantify those changes on a daily basis? Well, when I get a feedback from a velocity, I can see whether I'm handling this load the way that I want to handle it. And I think that the feedback also through research has shown there's improvement in performance when you give feedback, right? And I think that's, you can look at, we've talked about other people that on podcasts and stuff like Tony Holler and some of the stuff that he's doing as a track coach in high school. And he has record, rank, and publish, right? That was something that, and I think that is something that by doing that, you're quantifying your training, and you're also, once your athletes see a numerical number that they handled something, whether it be a speed, whether running on the field or speed on a barbell, they have something to attack the next rep. And I think that intent changes your training from rep to rep, and you get a much higher quality training when you have that feedback. And that's, I think, one of the biggest advantages velocity-based training can give you versus traditional training. And we've talked about this. I almost don't even like the term velocity-based training sometimes because I think people get stuck that it always means fast. And it doesn't always.
That was going to be my next question. Is there a better name for it?
You know what? That's it. I haven't spent a lot of time. I've spent more time complaining about it than thinking about the solutions. That's my fault. But I think that getting, That's a good question. I'm gonna spend some time on that when we get off this, because I think there's a better way to attack it. I don't know if you're going to change the term velocity based training because of how it's stuck now, but it's not always how fast the bar moves. What you need to understand too, in most sports, power is a very important metric that you're looking at and producing, and velocity is just a simple component of power. And so it's a very important component, and that's where I think that having it, is very vital. Now, there's also like a velocity-based training continuum, right? Some people, if you think of the old Tendo unit, you just use it as a simple feedback. That's a very basic way. And then some people on the very other end use it to manage every load that they do with the athlete, every cutoff set that they do, how many reps they do per set. And so you can get really, really nitty gritty with it to where you don't ever have a percentage on the bar or a load prescribed. And so, I think logistics drives everything that we do. If you're dealing with 110 football athletes, sometimes if you have a limited time constraint, you might not be able to do that true nitty gritty velocity based training. And if you're in a one-on-one private training session, you have one client, I think you can go down a rabbit hole and really dial in their training to maximize what they have in the tank every single day. And I think that will show up in their results if you can do that with them.
Yeah. So when you were talking about the 36% swing in a person's 1RM, I'm at the bottom of that 36%. That's when you said that, I laughed and I was thinking, I'm at the bottom of that 36% right now. Training's not going so well. So that was funny. Did you see me laugh?
Yeah.
I laughed.
Hey, Father Time's undefeated, right?
Yeah. Amen to that. I tell you what is going up though, and I feel good about it, is my weight. My body weight is going up. I'm maxing out.
We're cultivating mass.
Yeah. Oh my God. I can't stop eating. I wake up in the morning and think about what's for dinner. I mean, that's the exact opposite of the way it's supposed to be. All right. Let's get back. All right. So, remember I said I was going to set a baseline here. So we didn't do this last time either. So I want to talk about the velocity zones. And I'm going to say 5. Okay. Me personally, I kind of like to separate absolute strength and circumax strength. I don't know if you've seen that on some of my stuff before, but and the reason why, well, let me just say this. Let me back up. All right. Let me get to the question. All right. So I want to talk about the 5 velocity zones and the specific quality or training adaptation that each zone represents. Okay. And so we'll start with absolute strength. All right. And I'm going to finish what I'd started there before I finish my question. But, to me, absolute strength means the greatest amount of weight that you can put on the bar and move it one time. But at 0.5 meters per second, which is the cutoff for absolute strength, I could do that 5 times. And so I call that circumax strength, and it's something that I got from the text, but I'm going to let you talk about all of that. So let's talk about what absolute strength is, the meaning, the velocities behind it. And I'm just going to open the floor up for you and let you roll.
Okay. So yeah, I agree with you. This is something that the absolute strength being at 0.5 meters and slower, we've discussed moving. Let's just take back squat, for example, moving a back squat at 0.49 meters per second or moving a back squat at 0.34 meters per second is drastically different. Yeah. And the training effect, I think neurologically and neuromuscularly with the actual muscle is different. If you're going to truly 1 rep max test guys, which is what we do here as well, that is a trainable skill, and the bar has to be loaded for them to ever get good at moving heavy loads like that. And I think there is a psychological component to doing that as well, which I think is important. I think, something that we do here, and I don't want to give Coach Field all his secrets because I don't want him to get mad at me, but this is one thing that I think we have a PR bell here, which is, I really enjoy this. So it's an old boxing bell, like a ring bell that you have to go over, and you don't ring the bell when you PR. You ring the bell before you're about to attempt your PR. Ooh. And I think there's a drastic psychological difference in that. So he's all about teaching them how to perform under pressure, because when the bell rings, the entire weight room stops and everybody comes to that platform for that athlete to max out. And so now they have to perform because everybody in the room is staring at them. And I think that psychological component of getting under a heavy load, maintaining posture and position, and moving it well, which is also just as important, I think is really quality training. And so when you're talking about absolute strength, get back to the original question, I think there is two zones there. I think there's also there's these things within velocity-based training called minimum velocity thresholds. And so you have to, what it means is once the bar slows down below that threshold, the likelihood of you completing that rep or the next rep goes way down to almost 0%. And those minimal velocity thresholds are different for each exercise. So for back squat, it normally hovers around 0.3 meters per second. So getting an athlete between that 0.31 and 0.39 is a drastically different training effect than 0.4 to 0.49, even though it's still considered strength. And so I think it was in Perlpin, he was talking about like the best way to develop strength is around 80%, because it was something that you could also come back and return safely to. Numerous, training above 90%, there is a cost to that, is from a neural perspective that, that's why you have to programming it, and maybe not every week that you touch that percentage, but that is how you're going to actually get stronger, is touching those loads. You can take that back to speed. And I think of it the same way, is if you don't run at your max speed, then you're not getting faster at your max speed. I don't care what percentage of your max you're running, you need to run as fast as you can if you're going to change that. And I think the same applies in the weight room for absolute strength. So I think what it does allow you to do is, when an athlete has a good day, and let's say you think they should be below 0.5 at certain percentages, you can also, maybe they're above that and you need to load them heavier. And so instead of what I would consider wasting a strength day because they never really touched it, you can make sure now, because you have that feedback that, hey, look, we need to add load to this guy.
Now, when y'all are training, when y'all are training, let's say the velocity that day is 0.5 or below, and an athlete is at 0.59. Do they have the ability to add more weight themselves, or is that something the coach at that station does?
Well, the coach will be in charge of making sure that they're loading it. But what's great about our guys is they'll tell you, hey, coach, I'm like, look at this. And so we're monitoring that. And then also, this is something that, now it's tedious, but I think it's worth it. Every week when we go through and print the next week's sheets, we talk about each athlete individually as we go through their sheet.
Oh yeah.
And we'll adjust their maxes on their sheet based on how they performed. So let's say the last time they maxed out, they squatted 405. Their max, the entire training, is not going to stay at 405. It's going to get moved a little bit up and down each week based on how they're performing. So hopefully we can dial in their speeds the next week when they hit the bar. Then when they test again, it will be compared to the previous testing time that they tested. If that makes sense. So not
the movement. Yeah.
Right. So we'll continually change and adjust maxes based upon how they're performing. And I think that allows guys, they don't even know any different. They just look at their sheet. It says they need to back squat 375. They don't realize that if it was based on last week's percentage, it'd be 365. they just know, okay, this is what my sheet says, load it. And it's crazy to see when you give them, we saw this at LSU, when you give them exact velocities, how close they can actually get to it.
Yeah.
And you say, you got to move it at 0.48. They move it at 0.48. Like they're, it's impressive.
And that's the great thing about using the products. Now, so let's talk about the actual product that you use. You use Perch, and you can actually set the velocities that they're supposed to hit within the program. So, and correct me, if they're at it, let's say you tell the team that you want to be at 0.45 meters per second in squats today. If you're hitting 0.45, it's green, correct? Is that how it works, or is it blue? I forgot.
Blue. Yeah, it's blue.
Okay. All right.
And then if it's above that, it's green. And if it's below that, it's red.
Okay. So if, let's say the prescribed velocity is 0.45 and I'm at 0.5, then it's going to be green.
Yeah, it'll show that you're faster than that zone.
Yeah.
And then you can also, we can talk about this more too, is the velocity loss thresholds you can set there too. So if you're doing something, you can set how much percentage of the best rep of the set. Once it drops below a certain percentage of that velocity, it will show up a different bar, which means, okay, we're cutting the set at that, because that's why I set that threshold.
Yeah. How often do y'all do that?
Different.
Yeah.
So more so in hypertrophy phases, if we're trying to like, hey, look, this is a time we want to, this is where it's good. If you program, we've all been a part of, we've had athletes where, and I know you have, because we talked about this back in the day when you had Tendo, was you have some athletes who it doesn't matter the load on the bar. From 135 to 500, they move at the same speed. Like they just can't get their body to generate, their rate of force production is just lacking, and that's something we need to work on. We've also had athletes that everything they do is fast, and then they hit a roadblock once they get to a certain number, and the bar they fail. So you might see they're squatting, and they stand up at 0.42, and you're like, all right, well, that's not your 1 rep max. We're loading it, and you put 10 pounds on, and they fail the next rep, and you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. On their load velocity profile, it's going to show how they just don't handle the heavier loads. So they just need to get stronger. And so kind of you can individualize where guys need to go and what they need to focus on. Because there was an athlete you had years ago that before you were implementing VBT on a mass scale, you said he did everything on a Tendo just because he needed to work on his rate of force development.
Yeah. We had a couple of guys. Yeah.
And so that, we've seen that in some of these guys that they just, traditionally it's more of like linemen. Well, they're strong and they're great at moving everything at a certain speed, but they're not very twitchy. Yeah. And then some of your skill guys, they do everything well until they hit a certain load, and then they just fall off a cliff. And so, okay, we need to make that guy stronger.
Yeah, the two guys, one was a center and one was a linebacker. And after the first day of practice, the head coach said, these two will never play. And I almost fell out of my chair. I'd been training them, all summer long. And first day of training camp, they were freshmen. And the head coach said, these guys will never play. And so I just sat there, and he goes, they're not powerful. They can't generate power. And I was like, well, I'll show you. So I went back to the staff. I went back to the weight room, and I told our guys, I said, when these two train, I don't care what exercise it is, we're going to teach those guys and develop the ability to be powerful. And one, and I'm not kidding you now, but I don't want to embarrass anybody or give anyone a reference of time, but one became an All-American. And then the other one, I'll tell you, the linebacker became an All-American because we've had enough All-American linebackers here to take you a little while to figure that out. But then the center went on to play 3-4 years in the NFL and actually started at one time. So, yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So
Yeah. So, well, that's the benefit of it. There's so much more that's going on the cellular level, okay,
Mm-hmm.
within the organism than just moving a weight fast. And there's rate coding, there's synchronization, there's all types of adaptations. I listened to somebody the other day, and I think it was Travis Mash
Mm-hmm.
and someone else was doing a podcast, and they talked about like 5 or 6 different types of muscle fibers. When I was in college, there was type
Mm-hmm.
1, type 2, and that was it. But there's so many different adaptations that take place when you're training that you just can't rubber stamp every kid that comes to the weight room or football practice and says, this kid will never play because, and this kid is going to be an All-American because there's just way too much going on there. So I just took it as a challenge and said, all right, boys, let's go to work.
Yeah,
And
one thing
they
that's
both
cool
become
now
great players. Yeah.
is um, when you get a new freshman group in your class, you don't know where they're starting. What's their starting point?
Yeah.
And so when I had the new freshman that came this spring, I let the velocity guide a lot of the loading when we started. And so you stare at this stuff long enough, you start knowing like what it should look like and what it doesn't. And, there's some guys, the Olympic lifts are different. Technique is going to be the barometer, a lot of those new guys, but some of your strength movements, especially squatting, like we were able to dial in where they were going to be at from a max perspective really early on. So now we're training them optimally wherever they're at. And this is this is cool. High school strength conditioning has come so far and is continuing to improve. And obviously having something like the Moffitt method is going to help a lot of schools as well. But shout out. but what's cool is you see these kids, some of these kids that came from a really good high school program were able to step in day one, had good technique, and all right, well, we're not going to slow cook them the same way that the other kid that came in that has never touched a barbell,
Right.
And those two guys, there's 2 guys in particular I can think of that came in with this class that they were able to enter their first spring ball in an ACC school and contribute right away. They were physically prepared to do that. And if we didn't have a ways of measuring it, I probably wouldn't have been as aggressive loading them as I was. And they got much better. And both of those guys, one of them was a running back. He's put on 18 pounds since January as a running back, and the tight end put on 11. And so their numbers are going up, but now by the time we start fall camp, we're going to forget that they're freshmen. They're just going to be a part of the team. And I think that's a cool way as well when you're in that environment with people maybe with lower training age, that it is a tool that allows you to monitor your program much better than if you didn't have it.
Yeah. All right, let's talk accelerative strength.
Yep.
And, where they fall in the velocities and you got the floor.
Yeah, so accelerative strength. So this is going to be the zone.
Wait, let me interrupt for a second. Not one of the sexy qualities that you often hear about, because it's kind of in that gray area.
It's in the gray area, but it's also probably, if you looked at your training, you might spend the most amount of time there when you're in a hypertrophy phase or you're in a strength building phase. If you're looking at like the Vermeil hierarchy of training, which still holds a ton of merit in all of our training today, right? Once you get out of the work capacity phase and you get into strength, you're probably spending more time in accelerative strength than you are in just absolute strength. And that's because you're going to be spending time at 75 and 80% in that zone, because your zone is 0.5 meters per second to 0.75 meters per second. And I think the best way to think about it is it's the best zone to move heavy weight fast. That's where you're going to develop so many training qualities at the base of the pyramid that I think the better you are in your accelerative strength zone, the better your absolute strength is going to eventually become, that you can build upon it. It's also the safest time or space to be in there. So while you're developing some of your work capacity qualities of just getting volume in the weight room, and we know if hypertrophy is your goal, then volume is your king in that world. You're going to be able to get that volume from that zone because the load isn't heavy enough where technique is going to break down. And if your technique breaks down a little bit in this zone, you're probably still safe enough to stay in the zone and keep training. And then also from a hypertrophy zone, I think it's your maximal recoverable volume that is the most important thing. What can I absolutely do and recover from that's going to elicit the best result? And I think being in that accelerative strength zone is probably where you get your most bang for your buck in that training.
Yeah, especially with young kids, very safe zone for introducing, the strength exercises.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, the next zone is a sexy zone. You hear about this one a lot. And it's strength speed. So tell us about, the thresholds for velocities and the benefits of training here.
Okay. So the next two zones, right? They take two words and they interchange them. So you have strength speed and then speed strength. And I think whatever the first word is the emphasis of the word and of the training. So in strength speed, strength is still going to be your main goal, but your velocity is 0.75 to 1 meter per second on the zone. And it's probably going to be your biggest power zone. This is why it's a sexy zone, because when you're training true power, you're going to be in this strength speed zone. And I think the best term I've ever heard for this is torque. This is your torque zone. So if you're talking about speed strength, it's like punching somebody in the chest. And if you're talking about strength speed, you're talking about putting your fist through someone's chest. So if you're like that's kind of made sense to me. Mm-hmm. And so when you're moving a barbell like that is what your goal is. And this is also where, Louis Simmons, who obviously made VBT in America popular, this is where he spent his dynamic effort method in. This is where he was using that 0.8 meters per second, 0.85. This is where we saw most of our power produced in a back squat was in this zone, because you can load it heavy enough so the force is high, but the bar can still be moved fast enough. So if you have a higher force plus a higher velocity, obviously your power goes up. And so we spent a lot of time, and this is what's cool about velocity-based training too, is you can take an exercise like back squat and you can turn it into a power exercise, or you can load it heavier and turn it into an absolute strength exercise. And so, part of our in-season training there at LSU was a back squat was turned into a power exercise on a Monday. And we were in this strength speed zone during the season, and we found our absolute strength through other exercises. And I think the guys handled it well, and you can watch them move loads faster over time. And it's another way to quantify results. So instead of having to 1 rep max test them, you can show your guys, hey, look, you used to move 250 pounds at this speed. Now you move 250 pounds at this speed, or you're at the same speed, but now you're moving 275 at that speed. Right. And they see that, and they recognize that there is progress being made without necessarily testing him. That makes sense.
Yeah. No. All right. Let's speed strength.
Okay. So now speed strength. So speed strength, you're going into 1.0 meters per second to 1.3 meters per second. And this is mean velocity. I think it's important to talk about. This is where your Olympic lifts come in. This is, if you're an Olympic weightlifter, this is where you would live with the cleans and jerks and snatches. This is why those exercises have so much value still in training, because you just don't move a barbell this fast in any other way in a controlled setting. And so, this is where, if you want to talk about the difference between peak and average velocity, because that's where, for those movements, you're gonna look at different metrics, and why would you? But the speed strength, speed being first, speed is the component that is probably most emphasized. So there's still power in this, and we would talk about this where there's two different types of power, right? There's high force and slower velocity, and there's higher velocity and lower force, and so you're getting more and more velocity as these movements go on this continuum and less force. But you're going to, I think the speed strength and the strength speed zones correlate to sport more than any other zones that you have. And that's why they're so important to train on a regular basis. And this is where, like with the Olympic lifts, because they live in this zone, you can train this zone year round because you're constantly having those movements somehow in and out of your program.
Yeah, and moving a heavy load at those velocities.
No doubt. Yes, that's where when we talked about the velocity loss thresholds and stuff like that, or your minimal velocity thresholds, how those are going to change per exercise. If the barbell slows down too much in a clean, you're just not going to catch the clean. And if same thing with a snatch, if the bar just slows too much, you're not getting under the barbell in a snatch. And so there are certain velocities that you have to obtain. And that's why, comparing, weightlifting to powerlifting, weightlifters, that translates to sport. They're so much more explosive just because of how they train at these speeds at such a regular basis. And so it's a very important zone. And I think it's how you training the muscle tissue in this, I think is important from also an injury prevention standpoint, is you're getting them to sequence and code at a certain and stretch and contract at certain speeds that I think carries over to the field a lot more than some of the other training.
All right. Now you touched on peak power here and peak velocity. Mm-hmm. When you look at the chart, knowing that these are mean velocities, it kind of throws you off when you start seeing peak velocity and the mean power versus the peak power. Can you explain the difference and why there is a considerable difference in the two velocities?
Yeah. So the mean velocity is the average of the velocity over the entire concentric phase of the movement. The peak velocity is the instantaneous fastest speed that bar reached during the movement in the concentric phase. And so you're taking a snapshot in time with peak velocity versus the entire length of the movement. Now, this is why it's important in the Olympic lifts. First and foremost, athletes come in different shapes and sizes. And so a perfect example, I think about this back at LSU. I don't know if you want to name names here. I think of Phoney and lifting next to Derek Dillon. And it's funny because I talked to both of those guys this week on the phone. And
all right, so give everyone like a perspective on this.
All right. So Stefan Sullivan, okay, he's 6'6", but he has an over 80-inch wingspan. So his arms are long, he's tall, and he's dynamic at that size as well. And then you have Derek Dillon, who ran a 4.28 40 when he got ready to go. So he's fast, but he's 5'10". And so when you put them next to each other, there's just a huge difference. So if you watch Derek Dillon lift, he was super sudden and dynamic with the bar. When the bar touched his hip, he was underneath it. It was like, wow. And if you watched Phoney, it was a little more methodical, but he was pulling the bar so much longer that if you looked at their average velocity and their peak velocity, Phoney beat him every time. And they just happened to lift next to each other almost every day. And so the amount of smack that was being talked from Phoney, because he was beating him all the time, and Derek would tell me my machines broke. And it was like a case study in real time of why these things are. But if I compared their peak velocities to each other, they were much more similar in nature. Mm-hmm. It just so happened. Now, this is my own, I don't know if you want to call it research, because you probably can't call it that in a true scientific setting. But staring at this for so long within the Olympic lifts, I do think that average velocity has value, because I think there's a technique component that you can tease out when you see a really slow average velocity, but their peak velocity still were, a 2.3 or whatever. It's right where you want it to be. So they're still moving the bar dynamically at some point in that movement, but somewhere that bar slows to, I would call it they're hitching their giddy up. It's
Yeah.
somewhere there's something going on in their poles that the bar is slowing down to a point that's going to affect probably the quality of their lift. And so it allows you to go back and kind of maybe take a video of them lifting, and you can start dialing, hey, where are you poor at? And we can get better at that one thing. And it probably will carry over to just the entire clean, and you'll see your numbers go up.
Yeah.
But yeah, so peak velocity is going to be what's most researched in the Olympic lifts, or dynamic ballistic movements, just because you can compare athletes of different sizes to each other more commonly. So, and it's also like the component, like I said, peak velocity is the component in peak power. And so I think that's going to play a role if you're looking at peak power and wattage, where they're producing it at. You got to kind of stare at their peak velocity as well.
All right. Last but certainly not least is starting strength.
So starting strength, this is simply put, it's how do you produce speed by overcoming inertia? Okay, so it's everything above 1.3 meters per second. Super ballistic. If you're starting from nothing and all of a sudden, so this would be teaching somebody to change direction at the bottom of a squat, going back up to concentrically, right? Teaching them how to get out of that bottom position. This is something that I think when you're training all of these qualities, that they all need to be in your program. And this is one component of doing something. This might be a med ball throw. This might be, it's hard to do stuff with a barbell this fast, which was really cool to see some of our guys with some of our velocity squatting. Is I was seeing numbers in the 1.4s, with some of these guys, because some of our velocity days, we lightened it enough where we were squatting 30%, in an in-season setting before a game. And that's normally where you're going to see some of this starting strength zone is going to be around that 30% or lower, right? So then you got to ask yourself, okay, if I'm going to move this light of a load, do I need to do it with a barbell, or should I do it with a different implement or something like that? Right. And what's cool is when you see all this speed, and this is kind of a different caveat, but there is, the fastest you're going to see a barbell move in the weight room at a peak velocity is probably about around 3 meters per second with a lighter snatch. And that's the fastest you can move a bar, which is why that movement is so awesome. And it still has so much tremendous value in the weight room. But when you go look at max sprinting, you're talking about guys that are sprinting between 9.5 and 10 meters per second. So there is still nothing from a central nervous system development standpoint that will ever beat getting an athlete to sprint a max sprint. I don't care. And that was, once you realize that these bar velocities and velocity-based training is the same metric as running speeds, and you start adding, meters per second to meters per second, and you do realize how drastically different a true sprint is. That's why it still has, it's still the peak of the pyramid, if you will, the tip of the spear of speed.
Yeah. All right. So you mentioned this earlier. How much work have y'all done with load velocity and or force velocity profiles using the Perch?
Yeah. So with Perch, because, we don't, I kind of did it backwards. So instead of doing it a traditional way where you would basically have somebody conduct a 1-rep max test, but you would just track their velocity as they got closer to their 1RM. The cool thing about load velocity profiling is it's very linear. All the research is very, very linear. It's a straight line from when you start at, 20% of your 1RM and work your way up to 100% of your 1RM. And so what I did is I had just accumulated so much data from our players from 30% to their maxes that I could go back in and then create the load velocity profile with more than just one testing day. Truly have a considerable amount of reps at each percentage, and it came out to be very, very linear. And you also have to take into account, what are you emphasizing in your training? So with our velocity day for spring, we did between 40 and 50% with our percentages that we were working between. So 50% was as heavy as we went. And so because we put so much emphasis at that zone, when you look at our load velocity profiles, well, we performed really well at 50%. If we had done it at a different percentage, we probably would see some of those percentages have an uptick in speed just because we spent so much emphasis there. The same thing with when I was tracking 80% over the course of all spring. The reason I chose 80% from a strength movement is just because we hit it more often than we would hit 85 or 90. So I would accumulate more data. So that way, even on those days that maybe we hit 85 or 90, we still kind of trained through 80%. So I would get data at 80% every time. You can see how they got better at those qualities, but because we would emphasize certain days, you might see a spike in some of those velocities. And then also if you track it over time, there's certain times of the year that fatigue is a component and volume is a component. So if I'm doing 85% for sets of 3, well, that bar is going to start slowing down from a fatigue. Yeah. And I want it to. That's the whole reason. That's what we're trying to train for. We're trying to create that. And so if I was trying to compare maybe an in-season 80% versus a hard training day in the middle of the summer, well, the hard training day is probably going to look much worse. But how much volume was I doing per set versus a single or a double in an in-season program? So all of those are going to play. So you got to look at the sum of everything that you're doing. Yeah. So in some of the reports that I'm creating now, I call it my big picture note at the bottom. And I just spell out, where are we at in the program? What did we do today or this week? What's our volume like? So that way in a year from now, when I look back, I have the big picture note of why we handled the loads this way. And I'm not trying to guess why were we better in this month versus this month.
Do you include the RSI with that from any force plate data is on that sheet?
Not on my sheet, no, but because I have a different report with our jumps on that.
You can look at
but it is interesting. Yeah. So we were talking about this. So I kind of mentioned this the first time we had talked, where in an in-season program, we had selected 12 guys that jumped every day. And so this spring, I had 12 guys that we jumped every day that we practiced. So they jumped 3 days a week. And they'd come in the morning, and they had a 5 to 7 minute warm up that we had. And then they got on the force plate, did 3 counter movement jumps and left. And I tracked it overall spring ball. And what was really cool to see is the majority of the guys, after our velocity squat day on a Friday, how much better they felt coming into the building on Saturday for our scrimmage or games. And for particularly, we had a running back and a tight end. And if I could show you the graph, it was like a perfect, they would go here and then they jump after, it was a distinct wave, the jump after the velocity squat day the next day. There's about a 24 to 40 hour training effect from doing that. And on average, like the tight end would jump up 12% on his RSI and he would gain over an inch in his jump height off the plate. And for jump height, I'm looking at in inches, but I'm using the impulse to momentum equation and how they get this. So, he's jumping higher and way faster after that day. And he would always say how much better he felt. Now, they got a little more sleep going into that day too. So there's certain other components that we're tracking as well. But it was cool to see those guys. Some guys would come up to me because they'd feel tired in the middle of spring ball and say, look, I just need to get to velocity squat day and I'll be fine. And I'm like, hey, look, man, if you believe that, I'm in,
Yeah. Isn't that amazing?
I would say, just remember that this fall. When it's Thursday or Friday and we play on Saturday, remember how this made you feel, because this is going to be something that you're going to come in and do prior to game day. And the guys believe it. So, and we, same thing. We record it, we publish it, make sure guys see it. We put it up in the locker room. And they come in at, so it's just like they do with the velocity stuff on the field. Hey, how fast did I run today? We get that question all the time. How fast did I run? Because we publish it. We publish all their speeds. Then they come to us and how fast did I squat today? And so it's a cool buy-in.
But see, and so that's what I was going to say, that, coaching is part sales, and and create an atmosphere where people can see that the things that I do are improving my performance, and it only increases buy-in.
Mm-hmm.
And it adds value to everything that you're doing, and it perpetuates itself over and over and over again. That's so awesome. All right. So you touched on, you were talking about sets and, reps. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
You were talking about the 3 reps at 85% in
Mm-hmm.
season versus, the load that you were handling during the off season. So a lot of velocity based training has to do with specific loads that you need to train at, and then specific adaptations at those loads. But there isn't a lot said or included on the velocity charts for reps,
Mm-hmm.
okay, at particular velocities. So, this question just kind of popped up. How do you control the reps, or how do y'all, I should say, manage the reps and the volume that you're training at? And is there a correlation between particular volumes or particular rep ranges and velocities?
Yeah, I think we can talk a little bit about some of the velocity loss thresholds you can set and how those are going to affect training and adaptation and fatigue. But then also just from a general, we still program with the system of, certain percentages have certain rep ranges, and we're going to stay in those. And that's going to, so we know that like in an off-season setting, if it's week 3 of the summer program, like we're loading you, and there's going to be enough volume in that program to elicit a response. And you and I have talked about this. I think we've gotten so deep down this rabbit hole of the minimal effective dose, where I think sometimes that is incorrect. I think when, I said it earlier, your maximal recoverable volume, I think, is a more important metric because, I can speak specifically about football, but you need to build a level of robustness in the system and the tissue to handle that, because, your football is the one sport that the only day that you feel good is the first day of training camp. And from that point on, you play the entire season from a deficit. There's aches and pains that just go into it. And it's a sport where, in track and field, if you don't feel right, you're probably not going to run until you feel right. Well, in football, you're still playing on Saturday, and you would talk about this where you get in a car wreck and then you spend the week trying to knock the dings out and then get them ready for another car wreck.
It's like NASCAR.
Yeah.
Football is like NASCAR. You spend all week fixing the car, and then you run it out and you crash it and bang it, and then you go back in the shop on Monday.
So if you don't build a level of resiliency in your training in the weight room, that for the tissue, I think that your drop off as the season goes is going to be greater than if you have built that through the weight room. And so as far as our volume goes, it's calculated out, and then sometimes in let's say a hypertrophy setting, we might have some volume at the back end. So this is something that, Travis Mash talks a lot about with velocity-based training, which is really cool, where he has his weightlifters work up to a single at 0.45 meters per second on their training sessions. And then they find other volume after that, but they always touch strength. And I think that's really cool. And that's something we essentially try to do here. We try to touch 80% or above regularly, but then if you want to get volume, you can get it in the back end, either in the same movement or a different movement of that, of those same muscle group. But we did use some velocity loss threshold stuff, meaning how one athlete handles the volume or their volume set at the end of it versus another one is going to be different. And so maybe, this athlete did 8 reps at that percentage, but this athlete did 13 because he kept maintaining the same velocity. Yeah. And so with the velocity thresholds, what it states is the less percentage of velocity loss, you're going to have the less fatigue and muscle damage. So if I'm trying to keep an athlete super sharp and ready to perform, then I might put their velocity loss threshold at 10%, meaning for whatever their best rep is per set, when it drops 10%, then I'm going to cut the set and we're going to wait and do another, give some time between our sets. But if I'm really trying to elicit a fatigue or an adaptation, then I might put 20 or 30% on my velocity loss. And so the athlete is going to fatigue over a greater amount of reps per set. And I'm going to create a bigger stimulus to that muscle, right? Now I need to know that there's going to be a compound effect that I need to give them time to recover from that type of training differently than the other stuff. But that's one way that I could use velocity from a set and rep range where I don't know how many reps they can do, because maybe 3x8 for one athlete is easy, but 3x8 for another athlete at that percentage is super hard. And I think having velocity loss thresholds now allows you to train those athletes very similarly based on how their central nervous system functions. And then I think this is also something where you can talk about cluster sets. And, Cal Dietz talked about this in his book and in triphasic, but cluster sets, there's a study that was shown where one group did 6 sets of 6 reps and another group did a cluster set of 2 3 times for 6 sets. And so they would do 2 reps, take a break, do 2 reps, take a break, do 2 reps, take a break to get their 6 reps in. And their power production over the course of all of their sets was considerably higher than the one that did 6x6. So you can get more quality training through a cluster set based off of that, because your velocity will be maintained throughout that with a little bit of break. And some of the other teams that I trained, I kind of dabbled in this with their slow eccentrics. And so when you do a slow eccentric movement, obviously when you're taking that velocity component out of that, it's really hard on the concentric portion of the movement. So it's harder to load that super heavy if you're going to have a bunch of volume in your set. And so I would do cluster sets of singles or doubles, but then I was able to load them at about 80% of their 1RM in their slow eccentric. And so it was a way that I could manage the volume with the velocity and then maintain quality over the course of their training rather than having their technique break down so much because of fatigue.
Dropping knowledge bombs. You've done well. All right. So this is something that you touched on briefly early on. Mm-hmm. Do you notice a difference in the velocities at certain percentage of an athlete's 1RM between exercises? So for instance, bench and squat.
No doubt. 100%. So I've realized that, for instance, let's take bench
this
press.
chart isn't like,
it's not a one size fits all.
Yeah. Not a one size fits all.
No.
And
yep.
Go ahead.
Well, and training age is going to play a role in this too. If you have somebody who's a very accomplished lifter, right? Somebody who's a very accomplished lifter, they're going to be able to grind a set out. And so some of these velocity zones will actually shift slower than what's prescribed, if that makes sense.
I had to let the dog out. Aaron just came home, so Boone wants to go see Aaron.
There you go.
All right, so say that again. I am so sorry.
No. So take it. The more accomplished or the higher the training ages of a lifter, some of these velocity zones are going to shift slower because they're going to be able to grind out. Was this Aaron?
Sorry.
Can you say what's up?
Yeah, come here. It's Jeremy.
What's up, dude?
Hey, Jeremy. I can't hear you.
Hey, man. I know you can't. Hey, it's great to see your face, though.
Yeah, he said it's great to see your face. No, he's got back straps. Go.
That's what that is?
Yeah.
Can I cook it?
Yeah, you can cook it.
All right.
I was going to ask you about that.
Good to see you, Jeremy.
You too, bud.
He's in Arkansas now?
No, that's Rodney's at Arkansas. He's still at Duke. Yeah.
Come on, Ben.
All right, Ben, go.
I want you downstairs.
Yeah. All right, sorry about that.
God bless.
Yeah, sorry about the interruption there.
Hey, real life.
Yeah, really live. Yeah, he just got off work. So he came in to see what's for dinner.
Well, backstraps is a good start.
Yeah.
It's a good start. Okay, so get back on track. the better a lifter is at lifting, the more accomplished they are as a lifter, the higher their training age. Their velocities can shift to slower than what the prescription is to hit their quality or their training quality. So somebody, let's say they're a really accomplished power lifter, they're going to be able to grind out a really slow clean or a bench squat or deadlift. Like you're going to see some slow movements. I think about when Jake would lift, and we would put it on the perch, and he could, he could grind out a heavy bench press, and then the velocity would be like a 0.16. You'd be like, we're
same thing on deadlift.
Yeah. So with the less training age, somebody that they're just not going to complete that movement. They're going to fail the rep. But also bench press, for instance, doesn't produce a lot of power. You can lighten the load enough, but it's just the way that you're set up on there. If I'm trying to produce power in an upper body exercise, I'm probably going to choose something different than what I'm going to look at. Also, you got to look at how far the bar moves. So if I'm looking at a push press versus a jerk, the push press might seem fast just because you're pushing it longer, where somebody who's really, really efficient at a jerk, the bar might only move 6 to 12 inches off the back by the time they snap underneath it. And so it just doesn't have enough movement for it to show up as super, super powerful. But we know that it is when you look at that. We did a comparison one day, I know, in the weight room, where we were looking at somebody doing a loaded barbell jump versus a split jerk. And it wasn't even close to the power output that you're producing in a jerk versus a loaded jump. It just, you can't mimic taking 300 pounds and snapping it over your head and standing the weight up on it in another way. You can't.
No.
And so, those velocities.
I went off on a tangent that day. If you remember, I went off.
I do.
Because
we had
and people don't do jerks, and you can generate as much power in a jerk as any movement, but you'll go do something else that's not nearly as efficient. Plus, there's a lot of other benefits to catching that bar overhead,
just from head to toe.
Yeah,
from head to toe.
It's a great movement.
Yeah.
It's my favorite lift, and so not enough people use it.
I agree. And, there's a lot of talk about deceleration training and all that other stuff. And, people are loading up barbells and taking a step forward to do deceleration, it totally works. I'm not saying it doesn't work.
Yeah.
But just do a split jerk and you see what you're doing from a unilateral perspective and staying. It's you have to be strong and dynamic to do that movement in a full range of motion.
Yeah.
But that's a different tangent. As you go down. And another component, thinking about some of this velocity-based training stuff too, is, the coach's eye is certainly still important, and I'm not trying to devalue that, but it's really hard to discern, 0.4 meters per second and 0.35 meters per second with the naked eye. But when you have a device, you can dial that in certainly a lot. You can. It's the concept of in the military of aim small, miss small. Yeah. You're just tightening up your pattern much tighter in your training and how you program versus just kind of hoping that you can see what you think you want to see.
Have you gotten validation for velocity-based training from using some of the other technologies that you have in the weight room? Can you cross-reference some of those things?
I think certainly with our velocity squat day this year and watching their jumps and watching guys, their RSI mod go up, their jump height go up, watching their eccentric braking rate of force development and their ability to hit the brakes. That definitely has a value in it. And I think mostly the force plate is going to be the best way to reference that. And I think that's why the force plate is so important, because it's kind of your metric for everything that you do, whether you run, or you're fatigued from that, or you fatigued from practice, or you fatigued from the weight room. The force plate can tease out a lot of that stuff. And you can't trick the force plate with just how fast it's taking measurements in time. You can't fake. And so, I reached out to other people in the sports science realm, in NFL organizations and other college teams, and people that are better at the force plate than I am, and just getting what their feedback and what they look at. And a lot of them still just go back to the raw data. Like if somebody's really good at the force plate, they want to go back and actually look at the jump from the raw data perspective, because that tells them so much more about the jump than maybe some type of metric. And what's cool about the force plate is I don't think the force plate's value isn't capturing a jump, a moment in time. It's about trends and watching an athlete, their trends over time. And how does training affect their trends over time, or the volume and fatigue of the field work or whatever they're doing. I think that's where the value comes in, is you need to jump enough or do enough testing on the force plate that you can really kind of inference, is there an issue going on, or is it just daily CNS undulation of training? And then it's, what else is the athlete doing in their life?
Yeah.
Are they sleeping? Are they eating? Are they studying hard? Are they partying? I mean, all that's going to play a role in how they jump.
Not eating too much.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's, it's the sum of everything. And that's where I think all of this technology, like none of the force plate stuff or even the velocity-based training stuff, a single training session doesn't move the needle. It's tracking it consistently over time, I think, is how you make your biggest bang for your buck. And that's where I don't think when people start down this journey, they don't need to make wholesale changes to their program just because they implemented a piece of technology. They need to keep doing what they're doing, and the technology will take care of itself to validate if what you're doing is maybe heading you in the right direction or not.
All right. So we're talking about force plates. Let's talk about asymmetries for a second. And so when you jump on the force plate, and I guess I've only used two force plates. I've used Sparta Science and the Vald's force decks. One has two force plates. The force decks by Vald has two force plates that you jump on. And then the Sparta Science just has one force plate. But when looking at asymmetries, do you see some of the same stuff when you compare your jumps on the force plate that you may see on a NORDBORD using Perch in your unilateral exercises? How do asymmetries appear to y'all using the different technologies?
Yeah, so a couple different things. So one, every athlete has asymmetries. There's no athlete that doesn't have asymmetries. Asymmetries are very, very common and normal, and it might be what makes that athlete who they are, and it's going to also depend on sport. Whether if you're a rotational athlete in baseball, if you're a rotational athlete in football and you're a kicker, if you're a track athlete and you're a jump, what's your jump leg? That's going to display itself on the force plate majorly. And so you might see some of these asymmetries and think, oh, we need to fix this, but some of it just might be who that athlete is. So I think that's where, like, talking about tracking over time is where, is this normal for them or is this an abnormally? What we saw, especially at LSU with our unilateral work on Perch, is that any asymmetries that we saw in a non-loaded exercise, like a jump on a force plate or a NORDBORD, would not show up once you loaded the exercise. And so once we loaded them, they had very, very, I think it was like a 1% difference between right and left limb on some of our unilateral work. I think the only place that really changes is if you have a real injury. Let's say somebody's coming back from an ACL and it's a long-term, they have some type of, their quad atrophied to a point, like you're going to see some of that stuff show up in the velocity-based training stuff. But something I did is, listening to people who really spend their whole life's work and research on force plates. Everybody has, this threshold of about 10% is the norm of asymmetry. And above that, you start flagging it. But really, it's about 20% that might be where you need to make some type of training difference in their program to make them a little more balanced. And so something that I did that we're getting ready to implement now going into the summer is I went through every single athlete on the team. I looked at their asymmetries on the force plate, and then I looked at their asymmetries on the NORDBORD. And if their asymmetry was above a certain threshold, okay, you're on the list. And then I would dig into that list more to where is your asymmetry showing up on the force plate different than the asymmetry that shows up on the NORDBORD? So let's say they always load to their right, and then you look at the NORDBORD, but their right hamstring is actually weaker than their left. Okay, then they just need to learn how to load differently and load that limb. So their protocol is going to be different. It's going to be more load focused of absorbing force. If it's the same, where they always load to their right and their left hamstring is weaker, then we're also going to emphasize some of their posterior chain work on that left side to make sure we bring their posterior chain back. And maybe that will correct some of the issue that we see from them. We look a lot at their peak landing forces. How are they absorbing force back on the plate? Some of the people that I've talked to brought up some good points, though, that, in an unloaded jump, just a counter movement jump, there's really not that great of an eccentric demand placed on the body to make that big of an inference in their eccentric loading in a jump. But it does tell a story of maybe something going on. And even some of the guys that I had jump on a regular basis, because they're part of the 12 guys, some of them were coming back from an injury they had the previous season. And so you'll have certain things like force at zero velocity asymmetry. A lot of that has to do with what you'll see is like it showed up in an ankle injury. And so the athlete just didn't want to have enough dorsiflexion. And so if you went back to his raw data in the jump, you would actually see the injured limb would leave the plate earlier than his non-injured limb. So he would push longer into the plate with the non-injured limb because he didn't want to go into that plantar flexion on the injured ankle. So those are, going back to the raw data, you can go back and then you video the athlete jump and you can show them that. And okay, then now what are we going to do to fix it in the weight room? And that could be mobility, it could be strengthening. And so they'll find time now. There's an extra asymmetry card in all their folders. From a mobility standpoint, here's some things that we found that your range of motion is lacking versus the other limb. And then from a force plate or NORDBORD asymmetry, here's some other exercises you need to come in and do on top of some of your normal training to attack some of your weaknesses.
Awesome. All right. So we're getting close. We're starting to get close to the end of this. You're doing a great job, man. Just knowledge bomb after knowledge bomb, man. Wow.
You got to get your sound effect.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't work, man. I've tried. It was way too much for me to try to do, but I can do. That's it. Oh. Did you hear that?
Yeah, I got it. Yeah.
Yeah. That's all I can do. No bomb. Dang. All right. So I got a couple of questions because, part of our audience, a major part of our audience is high school coaches. And so for many, this is kind of out of bounds, because they don't have access to these type of technologies. But it's changing. There are more and more schools that are doing this type of stuff, but not everyone can afford a Tendo, a GymAware, Perch, Elite Form, and all the other stuff that's available out there. Are there any cost-effective alternatives that you know of that a school could purchase and do some of the stuff that we talked about today?
Yeah, I think the most cost-effective one I've heard of is VMAX Pro. VMAX Pro, they're still wearable on the bar, but you just put it on the bar. And so, and then you can download the app right to your cell phone. And so you get it right on your iPhone or whatever. The only negative component of it is that if you have multiple VMAX Pros, they don't talk in the same system, meaning when you download the data, you kind of have to download them individually and then you combine them. So there's a little extra bookkeeping, I guess, on the back end of it. But I think it's a few $100s. And then you get all of the velocity stuff. And there's some pretty cool stuff in the VMAX Pro about where it kind of guides you and asks you, what is your goal training today? I want to train this quality. And if you move the bar, it'll say, okay, you need to load the bar this much more. And it'll kind of give you some guidance into how much to load onto the bar to reach the parameter that you're trying to train. So it's a neat little device. I've had multiple people use it and they're positive about it. And then if other people ask, well, what if I can't, let's say I have 20 racks in my weight room, I can't afford 20 perches. Like, can you afford 2? And start there. And what I would do is I would take my best athletes and I would train them on it. And then everyone else would be guided upon my best. So I'm making sure that my best athletes are trained optimally. And then everyone else, I can kind of make changes to their program based off what their training age is in that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a neat idea. And you could take turns, using
rotate.
it. Yeah.
Yep.
Rotate.
Yep.
That's a good idea.
So it's a way to start. And then maybe over the course of years, you might be able to build a more robust system. I think something that's cool, if you just go to like Perch's social media and some of the stuff, and some of their people, their company, as they've continued to grow, they've expanded a lot of people's roles and brought on a lot of good people that have come from other technology companies like Catapult and people who have been in that type of sport tech game for a long time. And they're putting out more and more educational content as well. Yeah. And so you can learn a lot about this, but also Perch is now starting to do this thing where they're not just tracking barbells, they're tracking human movement.
I know. And so that's really neat. Yeah.
So I've been working with Jacob and Nika and them there, and Jordan, their IT guy, about, okay, what are some main metrics of a force plate that we can maybe get from a jump? Can you get an RSI mod off of taking a video of their jump, and if you could couple that with what you can do VBT wise, now when a weight room that maybe doesn't have the budget, they could buy a Perch, and now you're getting 2 systems in one essentially. Yeah. Because you can have your guys do jump testing and you can have them track some velo. So, they've continued to evolve, which is really, really cool.
That would be like having a force plate in your platform.
Yeah. Yes. That's like the ultimate goal of how do you, and I think another thing that makes Perch, I've had the best luck with them or the greatest investment of my time with them, because when you export the raw data file, it is very clean and easy to use. I've looked at some of the other ones that you look at their raw data file and it's a mess to try to organize that data, which if you don't come from any type of data background, which I certainly didn't, I've just learned over the years. If you gave it to a strength coach and he's like, look, I don't have time to do this, he's gonna not use it. It's just not user friendly, where Perch has been very user friendly from that standpoint.
Okay. So 2 questions come to mind. The first one, who probably helped you the most Excel wise? Because that's where all this, you started on the Excel documents.
Yeah. It's funny. I look at some of the Excel, my first ones that I handed you, and I'm like, oh my God, it's so terrible. It's so bad. I just had no idea. Well, it was a group effort, really. Travis had gone down, shout out to Trav. I know Trav got a shout out with Badger.
Yeah.
But Travis had built out the program with how we build our program, and it's a very intricate Excel file. And then, Vic had been doing it for years with Catapult data. And then, so taking that combination, and then honestly, Jake and I would sit there and we would sit on YouTube and go back and forth of how to create charts.
Self-taught.
It had to be self-taught. And it's one of those where, I think the whole sports science thing, it's gotten siloed to where it's like its own discipline.
Well, yeah. But now, are you a strength coach or a sports scientist?
I'm a strength coach.
Okay.
I'm a strength coach in my heart. Like that is, I want to be on the floor.
Yeah.
With the guys, whether it be doing a mobility thing with them after practice or yelling, you know what I mean? Like I want to be on the floor coaching, but the value you get from the data is so important. That's what started us down that road of like, all right, there's enough value here that we need to figure out how to mine this data and get it out of it, but without spending all day. Now, some people in the sports science setting, have really done some amazing things with some of this data collection, and it's forced me, like the things I'm pursuing now in Power BI and some of these other programs. If you'd have told me 5-6 years ago that I'd be doing that, I would laugh at you.
Yeah.
But now I just realized, like, I've learned enough to now, okay, I need to keep pursuing this. But then there's a disconnect with some of that sports science world where they don't implement anything. They're really good at collecting data, but and I think you got to find
interpret the data.
No, you got to find that bridge of what does this mean? And then how does it going to actually make change? Because if I'm just collecting data and making cool spreadsheets, but it doesn't change anything, then I'm just wasting a lot of time.
A lot of time.
And that's where I think it's been cool here, because there's been buy-in from, the top down of Coach Elko and Coach Feely and our athletic trainers. When we're rehabbing a hamstring and a return to play, our athletic trainers are coming, to me and Coach Feely asking about their running mechanics or metrics, and how, we're using the catapult data, the Perch data, the force plate data in the return to play protocol with conjunction with the physical therapist and the athletic trainer. And, and then how we monitor integrating them back to practice is all part of that. And so we have a lot of say in how an athlete returns to play, because they all have buy-in and from that. And so, I'm constantly trying to learn myself. I want, there's a lot for me to learn to get better in this realm. And that's something that I'm, going to continually, pursue.
And you add value as a coach, and that's critical.
Yeah. And I think, like, that's what's so cool about our industry is we have knowledge of the sport that we're coaching from a sport coach perspective. You spend enough time around it, you play the sport probably, and then you also spend more time with the athlete. So sometimes you'll hear a position coach say something about an athlete and you're like, you are so off. Like, you clearly don't know that kid. And then you get to do their return to play from an injury. You get to do their training. You touch them in every different facet of the program. And so when you have a coach that then values your input, you have a lot to say, and it's been
the greatest profession
for sure. Yeah.
It's the greatest profession in coaching. There's not in my humble opinion, there's not a better role for a young coach to take than being a strength coach, because it's you get so much more time with some of the finest human beings that walk the face of this earth. Now, the other question that came up was on NORDBORD. So did y'all? So did the staff do the NORDBORD? And I was wanting to know if your numbers.
Yeah, I appreciated your shout out with Badger on that. That was nice.
No, I'm just kidding.
They have improved. Now, I will say this: it's funny. So, Feely, God bless him, he pulled like 520.
Yeah,
and I know. Yeah, and so he talks smack to every player that doesn't beat 520. It's funny. So guys will like get back on there, like, let me try again, and I'm like, no, you're done with it. Like they're like, yeah,
you're gonna hurt yourself.
And
that's from his time doing Olympic lifts.
Oh, no doubt. Yeah, he and so it's like, if guys aren't screaming as they're going down on the NORDBORD, like, they're getting cussed at from across the room that they're not even trying. Like, it's impressive. I mean, we had 2D tackles last year pull over 720.
Oh wow!
I'd never seen that.
Holy
and they were competing.
Toledo.
Yeah, they were competing. So, our skill guys, like our best skill guys are above 500.
That is amazing.
And we also, we do Russians and razors. You
told me about the razors.
Yeah, so we do a Russian and a razor curl. We microdose it throughout their week, all throughout the year. So the NORDBORD doesn't elicit some weird new training stimulus that causes soreness. It's just kind of Then one day I have a roster that I'll cycle through, and if a guy hasn't hit a NORDBORD within a couple of weeks, then instead of doing Russians and razors with a partner, he goes over and does it on the NORDBORD.
Yeah, that's what I don't understand about people. They're afraid to do the NORDBORD. Do you have a NORDBORD? Yes. Do you use it? No. Why not? Because we're afraid somebody's going to get hurt. Well,
No, it's crazy.
hello.
No,
Yeah.
it's going to. And
And
so when
I've
I
seen
started
some,
looking at this,
I've seen some bad reps too.
yeah,
I mean, you got to coach
a
it.
lot of breaking at the waist. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I put the little screen right in front of them. Like they're staring
Yes.
at the screen as they're going down. Like they're looking at how hard
Yeah.
they're pulling.
Right.
But also, so I started looking at, it's funny you talk about knowledge bombs. Reading research. I'm just regurgitating other people's good stuff. But it's, the number one indicator of a soft tissue injury is a previous soft tissue injury.
Yeah.
In that same muscle. So like if you have a hamstring strain, the reason they're going to pull their hamstrings because they've had it pulled before. And so how do you get that and build that robustness back into it? And what we've seen is we put such an emphasis on it now that a lot of times that injured hamstring becomes stronger than the non-injured side at the other side. But when, if somebody has a hamstring strain, you need to test them as soon as you can, as soon as they can handle some type of test, whether it be an isometric 60-degree or something on the NORDBORD, or get them to do some type of eccentric work. Because if you don't get that muscle moving, you're prolonging its return to play. And so what I started looking at is as an athlete got closer, I would do it on NORDBORD when they were fresh, and their asymmetry would be like 2%. I said, okay, cool. You're going to practice tomorrow, but when you're done practicing, you're going to NORDBORD again. And then I would look at what was the fatigue rate of the hamstring. How much did that fatigue? And you would see as they would return to play, the farther they got out from the injury, they would have less of a fatigue rate in the injured hamstrings that closer. So it was a way for us to quantify how much practice that they were going to be allowed to do. So we weren't just going to bury them and let them go back to practice and whatever. And it would be, so we would give them some load cutoff stuff with them in practice and slowly get them into practice and football shape again from an injury. But it was cool to see testing it at different times is going to elicit a different response, but it's going to tell you kind of more of the whole picture.
All right. If I'm a coach and I don't have anything to do velocity-based training with, okay, what is some advice that you could share that the coach could use when planning and organizing his training to ensure that he gets a positive response and develops the necessary qualities to be a strong, powerful team?
Yeah, so there's enough research that you can find on traditional percentages and how they correlate to velocity. So let's say if you didn't have any type of feedback device, going back to basic exercise physiology and looking at the force velocity curve, I was taught from day one that the goal of a good training program was to move the entire curve to the right. And so you still need to start with, I think, that basic of like, you need to train heavy, you need to train light, and you need to train in between. And I think if you touch all of those percentages from 90% plus down to having days where you only have 40% on the bar and teaching them to put max intent into the bar, I think you can elicit a lot of the same training. You don't get the feedback or the competition, maybe a component of it, but you're making sure that you're training the entire continuum of that curve and that you're going to give them probably the best opportunity to be successful if you don't have that. And I think how do you accomplish that? You make sure that you're sprinting, make sure that you're lifting heavy weights, make sure that you have plyometrics in your program, and a lot of those fit into these velocity bands, if you will. And then I would also add, you need to have explosive movements in the weight room, whether that is your Olympic lifts or you just move a lower load faster. That's how you feel comfortable with training wise. But I think if you need to make sure that when you're training certain qualities, the quality of your training is the most important thing, and that your central nervous system can only adapt to so many things at one time. And so if it's supposed to be a strength day, then keep it a strength day. And if it's supposed to be a speed day, keep it a speed day. And if it's a power day, then keep it a power day. And if you keep it in that, I think that's simple. I think you can probably write a pretty good program that's, especially for, you know, if you're in a high school population, like they need all that. And so I think you could probably have a pretty well-rounded program.
Well, man, great job. Unbelievable. I appreciate you coming on.
No, appreciate you having me again. It's fun.
Yeah. So you ready to commit to a third one? No.
Hey, we'll find something to talk about. We'll find.
No.
Yeah. Well, I don't see that not happening. That's for sure.
Yeah. But you know, the amazing thing, and I said it at the beginning, as soon as we finished recording your first episode, we immediately started talking about this one. And, it's packed full of information and usable information for anyone, no matter where you're coaching.
Good. I hope somebody gets something out of it for sure.
Yeah. Make sure you tell everyone in that beautiful family of yours that I said hello, man.
I will. I'll tell the family you said hello.
Yeah. And tell everyone at Duke, tell Coach Feely I said what's up.
I will.
You can follow Coach Jacobs on Twitter at Jeremy_Jacobs_ and Instagram at Jers315. Jers315, not Germ.
No, Jers.
Yeah. So we talked about that last time.
Yeah.
This brings us to the end of today's podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Please, if you haven't already done so, follow the podcast and please share it with all your friends. If you have any questions about the Moffitt Method program, our training solutions for schools and teams at all levels, go to our website, themoffittmethod.fit, and check it out. You can connect with us through our website or email us at info@themoffittmethod.fit. Again, that is info@themoffittmethod.fit. Okay. Have a great day. Be strong, and we'll see you again next week.